Joel, please get up!
Try and sometimes you'll succeed to make this man of me. All my stolen missing parts I've no need for anymore.
Yeah, that little bitch got what he deserved.
You fucking...
Naughty Dog's The Last of Us was an incredible journey which was an amalgamation between the interactiveness of gaming and the emotional depth and character development which we could see with film. Its story, often cited as its greatest strength, it was really the characters of Joel and Ellie and their relationship which took centre stage. But for everything The Last of Us did well, it did have some areas which needed improvement, namely in some of its gameplay mechanics and the variety which goes along with that. It was a linear, story-driven adventure which amassed a huge number of fans and became one of PlayStation's most celebrated games. Now, with The Last of Us 2, a series is born, but has Naughty Dog delivered lightning in a bottle once again? After completing the game, I would say that overall the development team has delivered a solid game, even if it still has some issues brought forward from the first, whilst introducing a couple of new ones as well. The Last of Us 2 will be divisive for many players and especially fans, but whether you enjoy the direction that Naughty Dog have taken the story and characters in, it's clear they simply were not content in delivering a rehash of the first game for both better and worse. Now, to be upfront, there were times where I was in love with this game and others where I thought it just dragged on in areas where I was questioning some of the decisions made with its design, length and the pacing of the story. With a larger game world, more complex story and themes, and a far longer game, The Last of Us 2 is good overall, but whose greatest obstacle is overcoming the hurdle of being a follow-up to such a highly revered first game, and in that sense, I don't believe it matches, let alone surpasses its predecessor, and in a couple of instances, it falls quite short. So let's start with its visual presentation, and it's hard not to be impressed with what the PS4 is putting on the screen, even if my PS4 Pro sounded like it was going to take off at times. From its in-game gameplay to its cutscenes and their direction, The Last of Us 2 is a visual showcase for the platform at the end of its life cycle. With its semi-open world at times and large locations, the world of The Last of Us has been expanded upon a lot, and it takes the detail of the first game and just increases the size of the overall setting and the locations. The famous Naughty Dog long grass comes over from Uncharted, which sways gracefully as your character moves through it. Rain pours down, giving the environments a noticeable wet look, or seeing characters dripping wet when exiting a body of water. And the detailed look of mud all contribute to the game looking fantastic. Lighting is very impressive, whether that be from the glare of the sun or the many artificial light sources dotted around the environment at night. Couple this with the great smoke and fog effects, or how the light gently penetrates through the areas full of spores, and you'll constantly have moments that impress you from a visual standpoint. You'll come across large open areas with gently swaying trees with draw distances that extend far off, or seeing the sheer size and scale of large buildings complete with visible damage and debris laying around. This extends to interiors as well, which are littered with objects which have been thrown around or damaged, which gives the environment a sense of realism, which is really only let down by having what many games do. Numerous locked doors and doors blocked for what seems like no reason. Not a huge problem, but it is there. As we make our way further into the game, we see impressive water effects, complete with lapping waves and thunderstorms, complete with bolts of lightning, which looks fantastic. The detail extends to fire as well, which will give off a soft glow to surrounding objects, but the real star of the show are the character models, and especially when in the cutscenes. Now, to truly appreciate what the game is displaying, you need to look at the small details of character movement and interaction, which makes everything feel much more realistic and shows how many other games need to step up the quality of their motion capture, and really which can be more important than the amount of pixels the game is putting out. The impressive detail can be seen very early on by not only how Ellie's backpack looks from a visual standpoint, but how it moves according to how Ellie moves. Watching it sway from side to side, Ellie and the backpack are two distinct objects of course, and they behave like they would in real life. Often games where characters wear backpacks, once the player puts it on, it almost is infused into the player's skin and ceases to behave like anything but a static object. Watching Ellie or other characters touch their face or hair are those extra small touches that aren't necessary, but it's so good to see them there, further bringing the characters to life through small mannerisms and actions. When we get to the cutscenes, then the detail of the character models is further increased. With subtle eye and lip movement, which is so well done, it just proves that Naughty Dog are at the top of the game when it comes to motion capture. Often it's the small and subtle movements which gives believability to a character, and in a game such as this, it's almost a necessity in being able to bring the characters and their ordeal to life. The visual presentation is once again backed up with the excellent sound throughout, from its moving musical pieces which accompany important scenes, or whether the music takes a backseat in the stealth or exploration sections, through to it being turned way up when the action gets into gear. I found the music to be excellent throughout, but if I was to be critical, I don't think it ever reached the heights of the first game when it comes to the main theme songs. Those from the first game, even though I've heard them for years now and know them so well, they made more of an impression on me than what the second game has. Plus, there are many spots where music is completely lacking where I wish there was more, even if it was quiet and just provided an ambience in the background. But the real star for myself was that of the voice acting, where it's just fantastic throughout. Whether it be from the main characters or all the supporting cast, the range of emotions which they manage to convey is always well done, and again, they manage to convey subtlety at times when it's needed. Nothing ever really feels forced, and any issue doesn't arise from poor voice acting as much as from the writing and story itself and what actually happens. The performances given by the likes of Troy Baker, Ashley Johnson and Laura Bailey as Abby are all top notch, and even newer characters such as Dina and Jesse are given the same first class treatment as do returning characters such as Tommy. And that brings me to the story, which can go from great highs to lows, and much of this stems from the game's pacing, its flashbacks, and how the story darts around between different playable characters and time periods. I have no issue with what the story included, such as the introduction of another playable character in Abby, or how Joel dies, but Naughty Dog went much further than that. But I don't think it was delivered in the best possible way it could have been, and that's for a few reasons. As I mentioned previously, the story darts all over the place at times, switching between characters, flashbacks and time periods, where sometimes it just broke up any sort of rhythm I was trying to find when playing. Later in the game, where we are introduced to Abby's dad, who happened to be one of the doctors that was going to operate on Ellie in the first game, just seemed too forced, as he wasn't given any proper time to develop as anybody in the first game. And then we had when Joel and Tommy rescue Abby from the infected, and Tommy goes ahead and divulges too much information to these strangers, who then proceed to injure him and kill Joel. I don't have any issue with Joel dying, but having it happen so early in the game didn't really give enough time for the relationship of Joel and Ellie, which we had grown so close to in the first game, to actually go anywhere. Their most memorable scenes together were told in flashback. And again, when the story and pacing darts around all over the place, even if the flashback with the dinosaur and sitting in the Apollo space pod is one of the most memorable scenes in the entire game. The opposite of this was when Abby catches up with Ellie, kills Jesse, and is pointing the gun at Tommy. This scene was very good, but then it showed the pacing issue again. Instead of seeing how it would play out, it gets cut off and we don't revisit the scene again for hours and hours. What came next just left a sour taste in my mouth, as now I was forced to play through another section instead of the focus being on what I wanted it to be on. The issue isn't the story itself, it's the constant cutting and shifting between characters and areas and time periods. At times, it just made me ask the question of whether the whole of the Abby storyline should have just been some sort of DLC released later on, played out differently, or have been a part of The Last of Us 3, and this is where it raises another glaring issue I had with the story. The group with Abby, which included the likes of Owen and Mel, just didn't really do anything for me. I never felt attached to them at all and didn't really care what was going to happen to them, but I was forced to play through hours and hours of the game which involved them. Whether it be taking a heavily pregnant character in order to fight alongside me, which is completely stupid, or whether I'm forced to almost play through mundane minigames such as throwing a ball to a dog or shooting targets at the aquarium. The scenes are there to give screen time to the new characters and to show us a human side of Abby, but it's tedious at times when I want to get back to playing as Ellie, the main character of the entire game and perhaps the series. For The Last of Us 2 to really hit the mark for myself, I needed to really care about Abby and her plight. I understood her perspective on the events that happened, but it never hit the heights that I needed it to. As players, we are asked to understand where Abby is coming from and what she has gone through, but on the other hand, when it comes to Ellie, I thought she too would have gained perspective and an understanding as to why Joel did what he did, but that doesn't happen. And of course, that brings me to Ellie. In order to shock and deliver something truly different from the first game and expand the universe, Ellie comes across as almost a shell of her former self. Much of the talk before the game came out centered on her being a lesbian, but that is a complete non-issue. The issue lies in my attachment to Ellie when compared to the first game. In The Last of Us, we bonded with her, and she was a young girl with this gift, or curse depending on how you view it. We can see her strength and vulnerability whilst growing up in this post-apocalyptic world. We see her slowly grow closer to Joel, having that father figure she never had, and as the game went on, Joel reciprocated, bonding with Ellie and starting to let her into his world after the tragic loss of Sarah. But in The Last of Us 2, Ellie comes across as selfish and has no real issue with just killing people left, right and centre. Now this more brutal behaviour and view of the world could come through more experience and becoming older, but her selfishness was solidified for myself when she left Dina and the baby towards the end to accomplish what she felt she should, but it just comes across as immature as well. Leaving someone you supposedly love plus a child in order to go off and avenge Joel's death, which you weren't going to do anyway. You seem to have a bit of a fairy tale life on the farm. It took one visit from Tommy, who seemed to come out of nowhere, in order to change your mind, and this new life you had built and seemed to have been loving, spending time with Dina and the baby and dancing all around the house whilst taking every chance to try to get Dina in the sack, it was all thrown away to go after and kill Abby, which you didn't do anyway in the end. This constant back and forth, but the quick change of mind just didn't sit right for me. Not to mention that when playing as Abby, you actually fight Ellie, who is shooting a gun at you and can actually kill you. Ellie being able to kill you during the game doesn't fit in with the narrative and makes the ending just feel so weak. The back and forth and flashbacks of the storytelling, with it following many characters all at different time periods, isn't the most glaring issue either. The biggest problem with The Last of Us 2 was solidified for me when watching the scene with Joel and Ellie in the space pod and how it showed everything that made the first game so special. The relationship between the two was the foundation for all of the other elements of the game to be built on top of, and is a huge reason why so many love the first game so much. The sequel fails to recapture that. The great, complex and deep relationship that was established in the first game is nowhere to be seen in the second game. Firstly, there is the broken relationship between Joel and Ellie and how there isn't a whole lot of screen time for each of them. Plus, Ellie seeming to be pissed off at absolutely everything that Joel has done, will do, didn't do, what he said, what he didn't say. But that isn't the problem. No, the biggest problem is that there is really no relationship that I cared about anywhere near as much as I did with Joel and Ellie in the first game. Ellie and Dina could have been strong, but Dina barely gets a mention or enough game time for large sections of it. Then Ellie just leaves towards the end to find Abby. That relationship isn't strong enough. Abby and Owen, even with their history, it never reaches a level where I felt anything for them, regardless if we get a sex scene between the two, which seems like it's attempting to just be shocking. The introduction of Lev and Yara with Abby is too late in the game and doesn't manage to recapture that parent-child relationship of the first game. The only real relationship which could have been spectacular is that between Ellie and Abby, if the game had played out differently. We see the fight between them at the end, and just as Ellie is about to kill a weakened Abby, Ellie lets her go. Nothing wrong with this, except we now see Ellie is completely broken as a person. But even though Abby killed Joel, it's more about Ellie seeming to have this want or need to self-destruct. But there isn't enough time and effort devoted to these two characters to have any sort of bond I could connect with outside of simply wanting revenge on each other. But for how much more complex and grandiose The Last of Us 2 is over its predecessor, how it chooses to tell its story and develop its characters ultimately falls short. We always had Joel in the first game who lost his daughter, and we could see why he was the way he was. why he was distant towards Ellie, and how he grew as a character who ended up protecting Ellie above all else. We don't get something like this in the sequel. Ellie and Abby kill many people between them, want revenge on each other, but that never eventuated. Joel is given a brutal death by Abby, and then the game has the task to show us why Abby is such a good person and why we should care about playing half the game as her. Now, after I finished the game, I began to question whether I thought it was actually too long, but considering I'd put many more dozens of hours into other games, I concluded that that wasn't the issue. The game spent too much time on characters and areas that I personally just didn't care enough about, while spending too little on the characters and areas I'd grown to know and love. Joel was almost relegated to a side character and killed off too early, but he was also presented as a character whose previous actions were wrong. Ellie basically doesn't say anything positive about what Joel did at all, and seems to not understand why he did what he did at all. But between her lack of understanding of this and her immaturity when talking with Joel, plus leaving Dina and the baby towards the end, looking back at my time just showed me how I just didn't really like Ellie that much. Naughty Dog spent a lot of time building up these main characters in the first game, but now they are either dead or completely broken, and it's the player who gets to decide whether they actually feel empathy towards them and understand the decisions they made. So it isn't a problem with the game's length or being too long, it's just that the time could have been better spent. I just couldn't shake the fact that parts of what's on offer just came across as filler. Now, many people will probably say that I'm not meant to like many parts of the game's story, or how it's done to make the player feel uncomfortable, to really show the brutality and harshness of the world, or how no character is good or bad and they seem to all exist in a world of grey. But for the game's story to succeed for myself, I need to feel a connection and an understanding of the character's actions, whether I actually agree with them or not, and it all needs to be somewhat grounded in reality which fits in with this world. I need to feel empathy for characters, and it was just lacking. I needed to find a bond with characters such as the first game, which was deeper than what we were given, and it needed to play out more organically. And one last thing before moving on to the gameplay was the inclusion of not one, but two pregnancies, which can come across as an easy inclusion to manipulate the emotions of the player. It just felt forced. Like I mentioned, Mel being pregnant when killed is tragic, but she didn't really act like a heavily pregnant woman when she was alive. When it comes to gameplay, those who played the first game will feel right at home, as The Last of Us 2 really increases the violence associated with the kills. And with the more powerful hardware, the look and sounds of punching an enemy, stabbing or strangling them has never felt more brutal. Seeing the look of anger as Ellie or Abby take down an enemy has a great attention to detail, which is a good thing because you'll be doing it a lot, perhaps too much. There were times when I felt areas dragged on, as all I was really doing was sneaking around and taking them out one by one. If this sounds similar to the first game, then you'd be correct. I wasn't expecting some monumental shift in how the game played. When taking up firearms, that brutality of the melee combat is brought over to the weapons, where gunfights, especially on higher difficulties, have this urgency, life or death moment where it's kill or be killed. The sounds from the guns all have a strong impact, and that comes across when seeing the enemy drop. That goes for Ellie and Abby too, where being shot or hit knocks you off balance, which can make the encounters even more heart-stopping. You'll still be collecting items for upgrades and ammo from the environment, and you'll always have a feeling like there isn't enough. You'll need to assess each area or encounter and decide if you wish to use some of those scarce resources and ammo, or hold on to them for later. Stealth still plays a huge role in the gameplay, with silently taking down enemies or avoiding them altogether is a wise move, especially when the difficulty is increased. This becomes even more important when there are a large number of enemies or when around clickers, but you'll be fighting a lot of human enemies this time around, especially with the introduction of the Scars, a new group which plays into the story, especially later on with Lev and Yara. The gameplay itself isn't too far detached from the first game, which is to be expected, although I would have liked to have more of a proper cover system whereby you can anchor yourself behind an object. Upgrades also make a return, where players can improve their weapons or craft other items, which help them take down enemies easier, and these become much more important as the difficulty increases. You'll also be solving some basic environmental puzzles, and I'm glad that such things as moving crates around or having Ellie cross the water on pallets, such as in the first game, is kept to an absolute minimum, if not being taken out altogether. but at its core, when engaging in combat as Ellie or Abby, I found it pretty damn satisfying. Now, there is no doubt that The Last of Us 2 is a visual and audio showcase for the PS4 and delivers more characters and a story which is more complex than its predecessor, all set in a world which is larger, more diverse and more beautiful. But that doesn't make it a better game or even as good. The Last of Us 2 falls short in several areas for myself, which I've outlined, which dampen my enjoyment of the game, whilst others will find that it delivers beyond what the first game offered. There will be those watching this who may feel I don't understand the story or the themes or anything else, or that I simply didn't like it as much because it didn't offer what I was after, like it didn't meet my preconceived expectations, but that's not the case. The Last of Us 2 just fell short in how it told its story whilst delivering some new characters which just weren't as engaging to interact with. Playing large chunks of the story with all new characters, but which also lacked meaningful relationships and bonds, which was in the first game. The story jumps around too much and found myself just wanting to get back to play as Ellie and Joel before he died. The actions of some characters, including Ellie, just didn't make sense sometimes, or just weren't believable as to be something someone would do in that situation. Such as Tommy telling everything to a bunch of strangers, Mel being pregnant and going out on active duty, and others simply letting her, Ellie giving up her life with Dina and the baby to only let Abby survive. But then I had already died as Abby from Ellie when I was playing as her. The Last of Us 2 isn't a bad game at all, and in some areas it's fantastic. It just falls short as a sequel to such a beloved game in The Last of Us. It is a game worth playing should you have the means to, but it will divide gamers well into the future until the inevitable The Last of Us 3 comes. Only next time, I think many will be cautious going into it. No doubt Naughty Dog will create a narrative and game which they want to, for better and worse.